Hello, everybody. As Andy said, I'm going to be talking about our return to school or back to school scenario. But before I start, I'd just like to take a few moments to consider where we are and what the past few months have meant for schools, for education around the world. So first of all, it's probably helpful to reflect on the fact that about 1.5 billion learners have been affected by the closure of schools or school buildings in 194 countries, which have seen their education systems move from in-school buildings to at home. And this has never happened before, and we didn't really have any guidance as to what we should do once it did happen. And I think we've seen some amazing things being done by educators around the world to make sure that children stay learning when they're not in school. Nonetheless, we don't really know what the impact's going to be, but what we do know is that learning has been interrupted. So school buildings have been closed, remote learning's been set up, often very quickly, without much preparation or notice, which nobody expected. And parents have had to take some responsibility, particularly with the younger children, for their learning, for teaching them. And they're often not best suited to be doing that for a number of reasons. And in the international context in particular, parents might not even be speaking English as their home language. They might really not be equipped to teach certain topics. Certainly even very able parents in terms of their education level have struggled to teach some of the topics that children have been sent home from school. So children aren't getting that help and support necessarily in a number of cases. The other impact we're seeing internationally in particular is that a lot of families who may have been living in countries other than their home country are returning home. So schools are seeing perhaps reduced numbers for the time being. These economic consequences are changing, the nature of schools and how they're looking. Staff are sort of potentially returning to their home countries, and I think international schools at the moment are facing uncertainty in terms of recruitment. So, are they going to be able to recruit for September? The teachers they have recruited for September, are they coming to schools for the start of the academic year? So there are a number of issues that schools are facing, alongside the fact that the challenges of delivering, measuring and validating what learning has taken place loom quite large on a return to school. So how can we begin to measure the impact of what's happened? Well, first of all, I think it's worth acknowledging that the fact we've been thrown into this remote learning scenario paradigm has unleashed amazing creativity and effort from schools to support their learners, their pupils, to maintain that continuity of education. Schools have done really interesting things, setting on and offline tasks to engage students. There have been no guidelines. Everybody's been kind of in this together and muddling through. And many schools, many educators have risen to this challenge of ensuring that students continue their learning outside of school. The innovation has been amazing, keeping students connected with their school community. I've heard from our GL education schools about, virtual assemblies every morning, or using the digital tools for collaborative projects. Students putting little videos on the platform, teachers making videos for their students. All of that has been done in order to keep children motivated, to keep them engaged, and to keep them feeling that they're still part of that school community. And there's been a huge amount of energy and commitment which has gone into doing these things in order to make sure that students are still feeling connected to their schools. So an awful lot's been done. There's no doubt about it, and it's required time and energy and commitment on the part of teachers. But one of the things we don't know is how effective all this effort and energy has been in terms of students' progress. So how much progress have they actually made while they've been home rather than in school? And where are the gaps? So where are the topics that have had to be delivered through remote learning that haven't been understood or that students haven't engaged with? So that's what we start to talk about back to school. As we start to return in whatever shape or form that may take, we can begin to evaluate what the last few months have meant. And there might be some surprising results. There are already reports that some students who are really self-motivated and committed have actually benefited from this mode of delivery, and that perhaps they've made better than expected progress, while others, the motivation and engagement may be lagging off or at times has been challenging from the beginning. So it's very difficult for teachers to know if they've delivered tasks and topics through a digital platform, how engaged the students were, whether the distance learning had worked for them or not. And the only way they will really know that is when they start to measure what learning has actually taken place. The other thing I think is worth pointing out is that the medium of remote or digital learning is very new to all of us. And the daily feedback that happens in the classroom between pupils and teachers, it's very difficult to replicate that. And we don't quite yet know how we can do that in a remote or digital environment. So get those sort of, incremental bits of feedback that let you know where the student is, what they've understood and what they haven't understood. So until they return to school, there's probably little way of knowing which topics have been embedded and which ones require revisiting. So with all of that, where do we start? Where do schools start? Where do teachers start when they start to return to school? So I think every school has the priority of understanding the impact of lockdown on students' well-being and their engagement with learning, but also identifying those learning gaps. So has their motivation and engagement dwindled over this period? Do they still want to learn in the same way in class? The routines would have been disrupted. If they've had sort of a timetabled, synchronous learning environment of live lessons, going back into school is probably not that dissimilar from what they've been doing. Whereas if they've been set tasks and been able to set their own timetable a bit more, coming back into school, which is far more structured, may be quite difficult for them. The routine has been disrupted and they will need to reestablish that routine. There's also how they feel back in school. Will they be back in school in its entirety? So how they're feeling and whether their motivation and engagement has been affected are still questions, as well as the gaps in their learning. So are they where they would be had they been in school for this period of time? And so the answer is probably no for most students, but we don't know which bits they'll need to catch up on yet, or which bits they might have done really, really well. So schools are probably making some kind of plans to assess this when they return so that they can act quickly, so that they can fill in those gaps, so they can revisit the curriculum areas that might need to be revisited for particular students with particular groups, or for whole classes and whole year groups. There may be areas that need to be revisited. And also they want teachers and schools will want children to settle back into some kind of new normal as quickly as possible. And we're using the phrase new normal because we don't really know what schooling will look like when we do return. We know we're going to return, but will it be a partial reopening with students in school a couple of days a week, or only mornings or only afternoons, or will particular year groups go back and not others? And what does the continued blended learning model look like? So we know that everybody's been thrown into remote learning and has had to deal with it, but what bits of it will continue beyond a return to school? And how does that new teaching and learning model affect students' learning? So one of the important things I think we'll talk about first is when we go back to school, establishing a baseline from which to move forward. So assessing students and as they re-enter to understand what they might be able to do, how they might catch up, their profile as a learner. So one of the most common ways that a lot of schools choose to establish a baseline is using our GL Education's CAT4 assessment to give you those unparalleled insights into their abilities, their learning strengths and weaknesses. And at this point in time, having CAT4 results can be particularly useful for understanding how catch-up might work. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Obviously, CAT4 provides that unique profile of students' abilities, but it also provides exam indicators if you're doing a level D or above, so GCSE indicators, CBSE indicators, International Baccalaureate Diploma Program indicators to help you understand what the likely targets might be for those students and also what they might be capable of come exam time. So it's that potential of what students are able to achieve. The powerful thing about CAT4, of course, is that it's not curriculum. It's not a curriculum assessment. It's abilities assessment. It's about thinking and reasoning skills. So regardless of what has or hasn't been taught over the last few months, CAT4 will give you that picture and give you that clarity for students. The other thing is it gives you this unrivaled insight into what students might need in terms of their general support. So for example, if they have a relatively low quantitative score, you might find that they need more support catching up in numerical subjects. Whereas if they have a low verbal score, they might need more support in language content heavy subjects. So the relative weaknesses that a student might have will be magnified by the lost learning, and it could make catch-up potentially harder for those students in those areas. So understanding them is very, very useful in terms of making a plan. So for those of you who aren't familiar hugely with our CAT4 reports, the general characteristics of each student are given as a profile. This is from our group report, and it shows you how a class breaks down in terms of the group and the number of students in each group and where their spatial or verbal bias may lie. For students with English as an additional language, often their verbal skills to begin with are lower than one would expect because they need to acquire English in order to be able to show their verbal skills. But their other scores will give an indication of their overall ability, and once their English has improved, it'll give a more realistic profile in terms of how the student can attain. And then it gives you, and the report also gives you those quantitative, verbal, non-verbal, and spatial scores for each student. So you can really see, as I was saying earlier, if there is a weakness in an area, how that might affect their catch-up. And then there are the indicators, the GCSE indicators, the retrospective Key Stage 2, if you use that as a measure, which I know some schools do, UK international schools do, UK curriculum international schools do choose to do. There are also the indicators for, as I said, CBSE and International Baccalaureate Diploma Program. So once you've established your baseline with CAT4, you probably want to understand a bit more about what the gaps are in the actual core subject areas that have opened up over the last few months because of remote learning. So the Progress Test series provides you with baseline data in the core subjects to really understand what the starting point of these students is in September, and it allows you to then reflect on the 2020-2021 academic year when you assess them again in the summer, so you could really understand the progress they've made from this new, because the baseline will be new, they won't be where we expect them to be this autumn. It also allows the teachers and the senior leaders in the school to quickly identify the learning gaps, to see what hasn't been covered or what hasn't been securely understood. So I'd like to just also unpack that a tiny bit. We might assume something's been covered because it was set through remote learning and there were lessons delivered and students have even done some tasks, but hasn't been securely understood. They really understood that topic that was delivered during this time. And particularly in subjects like mathematics, where it's a topic that things build on moving forward, we would want to understand that that needs to be gone over or retaught in order for students to be secure. So any gaps in knowledge and understanding will be highlighted through the question level analysis in the progress test reports, and all the questions have been mapped to the different curricula. So you can really see if you're following a UK national curriculum, if you're following an IB curriculum, if you're following a CIE or a fieldwork curriculum, how those progress tests scores, question level analysis, show you where the gaps are. You can also identify if specific cohorts have excelled. So you might have a group of children who've done really well during this time. You might have other groups that have, as I said previously, lost their motivation and gaps have opened up. So it can help you plan that catch up, that curriculum planning for the autumn term on what needs to be revisited, but what is ultimately secure. So that's here's an example from the report of the question level analysis I was talking about, where it shows you how your group has done in relation to certain questions, and how if the whole group has not, answered a question correctly, or if the question is very low compared to what the average, so that's the pink line, you'd expect the average to be, you might want to revisit that area. We also have analysis by curriculum content area, so grouping together questions into a particular area of the curriculum, and that shows you how different areas of the students have performed against different areas of the curriculum. And there we can see for different subjects in mathematics, it's the content area. So is statistics particularly weak, or is algebra particularly weak or strong? And then we've got those mathematical process categories. So in terms of their fluency or their mathematical thinking, which are the areas you would want to concentrate on when you're looking to fill those gaps. Oh, sorry. The other area that is where we'd want to get a better understanding of where students are, particularly in an international context where a lot of students will not be English first language learners, they'll be additional language learners, is their reading skills. And reading is really, really key to the understanding of the curriculum, to the accessing of the curriculum in a school in which the students are being taught in English. So one of the things that people have observed over this period of remote learning and school closures is reading is the one thing children could do and could be getting on with, which is absolutely true. And even children who have read a lot at home, which is great, and they will have kept up their reading, they haven't been taught reading, they haven't been honing their reading skills. So particularly the skills like the inference skills might not have been as developed as they would be had those students been in school. And some schools might have done one-to-one reading lessons with their younger students, and they might still be, developing those skills. It's hard to make generalizations about what's happened. But one of the examples I'd like to use is that there was a teacher who I was speaking to recently who said that even a child that was reading a lot according to the parents, and they'd reassessed them as they were coming back into school now, wasn't where they expected them to be. So they were an able student who had been reading during this period of time, but they still hadn't developed the skills to the level that they would have expected. So it's very useful to know, to understand where students are in terms of their reading, in terms of, again, how they'll catch up. There are a number of educators who are saying that as they go back into school, starting with reading is really, really important, starting to understand where they are in terms of reading, because that's really the basis of everything else. It's the strong foundation. So our new group reading test allows you to get a good understanding of where students are in terms of their reading skills. Using reliable benchmarks, you can identify gaps in vocabulary as well as in reading skills, which is particularly important if they're going to access the curriculum, as I mentioned. And it gives your students the very best foundation for all subjects reading. So getting reading right for students is really critical. The new group reading test shows those discrepancies between decoding and comprehension. So where I was talking about students may have read a lot while they've been in lockdown, so they might have been going through a lot of texts, but had they really been comprehending them? Have they really been developing those comprehension skills? The benefit of the new group reading test, of course, is that it is adaptive, so it allows the students who are have more developed skills to be stretched, and for weaker students to not feel intimidated by the assessment. And the other thing that it's really helpful to do is if you do put reading interventions in place in your school, you can measure their impact after a period of time using the new group reading test, or NGRT. The new group reading test reports will give you the profile for the student in terms of their reading skills, and it'll also give you some suggestions, implications for teaching and learning about how they might need to develop those reading skills, and suggestions of how you as a teacher might help them and support them in doing that. There's also the breakdown of scores in terms of the sentence completion and passage comprehension, the sentence completion being more about decoding and the passage comprehension being more about comprehension skills such as retrieval and inference. The new group reading test will give you a progress measure if you've taken it before, so you can see whether particular students have actually made expected progress or not in terms of their reading. It also gives a reading age, which a lot of people find useful. And there you can see the different types of comprehension skills that the new group reading test assesses. So you can really hone in on which sort of practice and which sort of skills development a particular class or student or group of students would benefit from. So I've spoken a bit about getting a baseline, identifying gaps, and the importance of reading, which have all been very much around the academic nature of going back to school and getting learning back on track, which obviously we're all very concerned about and wanting to do. But the thing that we need to ensure before we can start making sure that learning gaps are redressed and that things get back on track with the return to school is really understanding where students are in terms of their attitudes and their mindset. They've also gone through quite a high anxiety period, as we all have, and they've been at home, and home might be a calm environment, it might be a less calm environment, it might be really conducive to learning, it might not be conducive to learning. They've had their own personal experiences, but the one thing that's the same for all of them is that they've been out of the routine of attending school, so going to school on a daily basis. And they might have certain thoughts and feelings about their learning as a result of it. The one example I wanted to use is that it seems to be emerging that one of the things that remote learning is not particularly good at the moment, or we don't know how to do effectively yet, is give students adequate praise. So not necessarily feedback on whether they got something right or wrong, but actually praise for efforts and for attention and for the sorts of things teachers do day to day in the classroom. And that students may have started to feel less confident in their own learning as a result of not receiving that sort of feedback on a regular basis. So that's one thing just to bear in mind, that there might be something that's happened to certain students over this period of time is that they've started to lack confidence in their own learning, or they've started to become a little bit unsure about whether or not they can do things. Teachers are really, really wonderful at saying to students, have another go, try again, we'll do this together, or buddying them up with another student to help them. And that boosts their confidence, and it makes them feel that they can tackle things perhaps beyond their current understanding. They've been quite isolated from those sorts of scenarios. So getting to understand how they're feeling is really important to settling them back into some kind of routine, regardless of that routine, whether or not that routine would be fully within school or whether it would be somewhat in and somewhat out of school, still partially remote or blended. So our PASS survey is really, really good in giving insight into how students are thinking and feeling. And we suggest that the PASS survey is used, that the reports are analysed, that certain measures are put in place to help students, and that the survey is then completed again to see if those measures have been effective, so you can compare those reports over time. If you're a school that's previously done a PASS survey, it will be very illuminating to compare a cohort's results on return in September to what they might have been at the same time or at another time when they were in school, perhaps last year. How has this closure affected how they feel about themselves and about their learning? So I find this personally incredibly interesting, how lockdown will have impacted students' attitudes and mindsets, their readiness to resume school routines, the impact on their confidence in learning, their perceived learning capability, and their preparedness to learn. Those are all things which within school are supported, but perhaps having been not in school have been less supported. They might have been supported. It's hard to know how every school has managed and has put measures in place and whether those have worked. Equally, have things like attitudes to attendance changed, because the notion of attending virtual school or remote learning is somewhat different to the notion of attending a building. And do students think differently about those things? The PASS survey will give you that insight, and the PASS interventions will give you really practical advice and support of strategies to use with students to help build up their confidence or help them if their perceived learning capacity is somewhat diminished. How do you support them to get into a better frame of mind for resuming learning in the way that they were more familiar with in the past? And particularly with students who perhaps have been out of school now for a while, they might even have forgotten what it was like to be in school, depending on their age, and re-establishing that may prove quite a challenge for them. So the other thing PASS helps you do is identify those children who might be hard to spot. So there might be children who are presenting as fine. They've come back. They seem to be really happy to be back, but actually they're carrying a fair amount of negative feelings, but they're not showing those outwardly. And PASS will help you to identify those children. And the most important thing I think about having an insight into students' attitudes and their feelings about school is that you don't have a complete picture of students if you don't understand what they're thinking and feeling at the moment. We can understand where they are academically, we can put measures in place to support their learning, but it's actually really impactful to know what they're thinking and feeling, and supporting that is vital. The point I made earlier about motivation and remote learning, we know from various research studies that actually providing positive reinforcement has a massive impact on students' attainment. And it doesn't have to be feedback based on their learning. It's feedback such as you've made a really good effort. Why don't you try again? Why don't you see if you can use better words? Why don't you try do that activity again, because you've got that bit right, but you might want to think about the other bits. So just by teachers encouraging students, that has an impact on their behavior within a learning environment. And in a remote environment, have they had that encouragement? They may very well have, but if they haven't, if it has been kind of asynchronous and the teacher there hasn't been a lot of feedback, has this impacted how they feel and their approach to their work? So all of that will help you give students the best possible support on their return to a schooling environment. These are the past factors that the past survey gives you feedback on in terms, and I had identified the ones I thought might be the ones we would be concerned about on return to school. The things around learning capability, self-regard, preparedness, confidence, but things like feelings to school, attitudes to teachers, their general work ethic, as well as their attitudes to attendance may well have been affected as well. So the past reports give you the information at different group levels against those factors. So how have, for example, boys and girls responded to the survey? If you can break it down that way, if you like, or particular year groups. You can look at have particular year groups been more affected than others. And there's a sort of traffic light or RAG status, red, amber, green status that's given in terms of the areas that are concerning. So, for example, the red there on preparedness for learning shows that they're not feeling very capable of tackling the learning they may have, but also they may be out of routine. The ones that are amber or yellow are the ones which probably should be investigated, because although they're not critical, they are not as good as they could be. There probably are issues there that are worth investigating and supporting. And the ones that are green generally show that they are feeling quite positive in these areas. I always say that a green doesn't mean ignore, it doesn't mean it's fine, tick the box and go on. Green is really good for the school to do some questioning about why is it green? So if we've got something like attitudes to attendance being green, are they really happy to come back to school? Or is it the fact that the school's done virtual assemblies every day to get them in to attend a remote learning world had a really positive impact? And that's a real opportunity to allow students to feed back to the school about why they feel positive in those areas, and for the school to get some sense that some of the things they've done have had an impact, and a positive one at that. So I think greens are just as good to investigate as yellows and reds are to address. So a short reflection before we go to questions about where we are. We won't know for a while what the impact of all of the school closures and interrupted schooling and interrupted education has been. I know that we have, we've realigned, we've gone remote. Those are all fantastic things that schools have done in moving from that physical space into a virtual space, but we don't know what it's going to look like for learning, for reading skills, for attitudes, for motivation of students. So it's an interesting time, if nothing else, because as we return, we will start to understand better what that impact has been and how we address it. We have early indications. We've had educational researchers do some modelling on, what interrupted schooling has looked like for students previously, but no situation has been quite like this one. What we do know is it's probably going to be quite variable. Different schools, different children, different environments will have had different impacts, and some of them may be unexpected. As I said earlier, some students may genuinely have thrived in this environment, whereas a lot of students may have lacked motivation, lacked engagement, and as a result, not much learning has taken place. There are a huge number of unknowns that all schools will have to respond to over the coming months until we have a clear picture. And I just wanted to end by saying that GL Education have the tools available, and we're here to support you and to help you determine what a positive way forward is in terms of your students learning, as well as they're settling back into school whenever you are wanting to receive that help, whenever you think it's going to be best to put those measures in place. So I'm going to hand over to the host to see if there are any questions and if we can answer any of them. And thank you very much for listening.